to this exciting lecture series sponsored by Montessori and Seattle Public Schools. It's been a great pleasure for me to organize this series with such an outstanding array of professionals dedicated to the values of respect, justice, and freedom for all people. It was Montessori's hope that the study of the child would bring the world's societies together in a common and universally beneficial cause. And together tonight, we all stand on the threshold of deeper understanding of our own human potential as we look from the past to the future and follow the child's footsteps to promote peace. Tonight's speaker will be introduced by Dr. Rosemarie McCartan, clinical psychologist and professor of education at the University of Washington for the past 20 years. Previous to her work at the University of Washington, she was assistant professor of education on the faculty of Seattle University from 1964 to 1969. She has also taught all elementary grade levels, and this includes preschool as well. She met Dr. Maria Montessori in 1958 while she was teaching first grade in Southern California. And after discussions with him and observations of the method, she began incorporating the Montessori philosophy of education into her classroom. Later, when she came to Seattle University, she became friends with E.M. Standing, teacher, biographer, and friend of Dr. Maria Montessori, who had been invited to work at Seattle University by Father Codd of the Educational Psychology Department. I am grateful that Rosemarie can be here tonight to present to you our most distinguished speaker. Rosemarie.
Thank you. Although it has been my lot to introduce many notable persons across the years, never have I had the genuine pleasure which is mine tonight. Professor Giovanni Costigan served as a professor at the University of Washington for over 41 years, and he continues today to lead both the community, the faculty, and the students who have the great grace to follow him. It is fitting that Dr. Costigan be the first speaker in this series devoted to Maria Montessori. Among Professor Costigan's contributions are articles, papers, books, telecourses, and lectures, far too numerous to mention. But one contribution leaps out from among the others, and that is the book entitled Peacemakers, a study of the Nobel Prize winners. Professor Costigan, a great historian, educator, and a wonderfully witty human being, is among the most learned men of our century. Those followers of Maria Montessori will see the parallel, if you have not already done so, between himself and Montessori in their search for peace. Dr. Costigan, like Maria Montessori, is an inspired teacher who has brought unique vision and insight to the study of humankind and to those events that have shaped the course of history. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you Professor Giovanni Costigan. Professor Costigan.
I should consider it a privilege for anyone to be asked to speak about Maria Montessori. And I'm glad to be here with you this evening. My only grounds for trepidation is that I don't know more about her. I've read what I can, but this is not the same thing as spending one's life trying to carry out the principles in education which she elaborated. I have spent most of my life in the field of education, but adult education, and not that of children or preschool or of infants, and they're vastly different worlds, as you must know. But I would like to say this, that having read what I can in the last few weeks about her, on the basis of what I had read years ago, I have come to feel a renewed admiration and respect, and indeed, if you can believe me, a feeling of humility and almost of awe that this single woman accomplished so much and dared to challenge the prejudice of her time and ours to the extent which she did. So I personally regard it as indeed a very great honor to be asked to speak, however inadequately, about Maria Montessori. Thank you for coming. She was born in 1870 and died at the age of 82 in 1952. You will notice that the year of her birth was also the year of the birth of the Kingdom of Italy, so that she and Italian nationalism grew up together. Italian democracy, we might also call it, with all its defects. She was born in a country, small country town, Chiaravalle, near Ancona on the Adriatic coast. And at the age of 12, her parents moved to Rome so that she had the advantage of a high school education in Rome, and later, of course, went herself to the University of Rome. She was an only child. I think this must have been of very great importance in formulating her view on life and her desire for a certain career. An only child. Her father, Alessandro, was a former army officer, a civil servant, a well-educated man. Her mother was a devout Catholic of a middle-class family, and the chief encouragement of her daughter when she was growing up. Her father was opposed to her taking up public positions and becoming a public figure, like the father of Golda Meir in this country. He was appalled at her boldness in daring to speak in public as she did. He later became, like the father of Golda Meir in Milwaukee, very proud of what she did. I think as you read, you are impressed with two qualities that she manifested from a very early age indeed. The origin of these we must hold in the lack of detailed knowledge, almost unexplainable in any child that shows them. The first was an extremely unusual degree of independence. She thought for herself. She didn't take anything for granted. Her father was baffled by this independence. He wanted a normal, affectionate, obedient child. She was a rebel. Her mother encouraged her, as Golda Meir's mother encouraged her. And the second quality which strikes one is her unusual intelligence, an extreme curiosity, common, of course, to all children if they're allowed to exercise it, and a desire for knowledge and more knowledge. The first form which this desire for knowledge took will strike all of us, I think, as unusual. She loved, as a child, mathematics. To this day, there's a very strong opinion, is there not, that most girls, most women, are somehow unfit by nature for such a subject as mathematics, too abstruse, too theoretical. I cannot help think myself, knowing little about it as I do, that the cultural and social pressures against a woman entering the field of mathematics are so strong still that that is sufficient to account for the superstition. In her days, of course, it was extremely strong. A girl becoming a mathematician, her father was dismayed. In my own case, no doubt I too was a victim of this superstition, but when I heard and read about Lisa Meitner, the atomic scientist who played a very large part in the discovery of nuclear fission, of course this prejudice was destroyed if it was there. If one woman can do such a thing as Marian Anderson singing in the DAR Hall some 50 years ago, perhaps all Negro women can do it. And if one woman can be one of the world's greatest mathematicians it might strike one, perhaps other women can too, but for the obstacles put in their way, and which still exist, undoubtedly. At any rate, rebel and intellect. When she decided to go to the University of Rome at the age of 20, in 1890 in other words, there were no other women students. She was the only one. Think, if we can, of what a challenge, of what difficulties, what prejudices she had to overcome. Italian males were undoubtedly, then as now, proud of their chivalry, proud of their gallantry. They put every conceivable obstacle in her way. They taunted her, laughed at her, humiliated her, took the best chairs in any lecture room, so she had to take the poorest. She wasn't the only woman, of course, who suffered this kind of, I was going to call it infantile discrimination. It was a school for character, for self-discipline, for learning. She finally won their respect, especially when she graduated, one of the highest in her class, some years later. Then she decided, during the course of her studies, her interest shifted from mathematics to subjects that had a more directly human connection. And she determined, I think about after she entered the university, to become a doctor. She was she was the first woman in a nation of more than 6 million women, the first to enter a university. And she was the first Italian woman ever to study for the degree of MD and to become a doctor. Her father was dismayed, a woman doctor, the first in Italy. There are stories, she told them herself, of being exposed in a kind of brutal, unprepared fashion, to be present at autopsies, to see and handle corpses, jokes played upon her with regard to skulls, encountered accidentally in a semi-darkness, or to handle skeletons. And she says, I was so overcome with nausea, disgust, I felt I could not go on. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this sort of thing, but she persevered. And when she finished her work in 1896, she became a doctor at the age of 26. She gained the universal respect of the medical faculty and of her fellow students. This was a remarkable person. She spent the next 10 years, roughly from 1896 to 1906, involved in two fields, psychiatry and pedagogy. She not only wanted to know what makes human beings act the way they do, and particularly what made children act as they do. She early became certain that the key to adult behavior lay in the child. And she fostered these two interests, reading very widely in psychology, psychiatry, philosophy. In 1900, when she was 30 years of age, she did another peculiar thing. She took time off to re-enter the University of Rome. In our time, people often re-enter the university for later studies. It was unheard of then. Once you'd finished your work, got your degree, you'd finish with the university. She entered to study philosophy. sociology, anthropology. She spent these 5 or 6 years reading very widely indeed, not publishing very much, but still publishing psychiatric studies of children. She was asked, I don't remember if I ever knew the circumstances, she was asked in 1896, just after graduation, probably the fact that she was the first, it was well known, the only woman doctor in Italy. She was asked to speak to an international conference of women at Bern, the capital of Switzerland. She went, as you may suppose, with some misgivings. First time she'd ever left Italy, speaking alone. She found another quality. She was an extraordinarily gifted public speaker. Everyone spoke of her eloquence, of the beauty of her voice, of her ability to magnetize large numbers of people. And from then on, she had another career, that of public speaker, later to be used, of course, on behalf of her ideas about education. In the great cities of northern Italy, Turin, Milan, Venice, Bologna, as well as in Rome, she was sought after by thousands. She suddenly found herself, after this shy, reclusive childhood, to be an enormous popular success. It seems not to have got to her head. One of the first things she emphasized in her first international appearance at Bern in Switzerland was the position of women in the modern world. She said, I speak on behalf of 7 million Italian women. And while what she said was not directed to education, I think you might like to hear the direct words that she used. She never called herself a feminist. She always dissociated herself later from any avowedly feminist movement. But her goals were the same. And she herself obviously was a conspicuous example of what the ideals of feminism might achieve. This is a part, I believe, of her remarks at Bern as a young woman. Eventually, she said, the woman of the future will have equal rights as well as equal duties. She will have a new self-awareness and will find her own strength in an emancipated femininity. Family life, as we know it, will change. But it is absurd to think that feminism will destroy married feelings. The new woman will marry and have children out of choice, not because matrimony and maternity are imposed upon her, and she will exercise control over the health and well-being of the next generation and inaugurate a reign of peace. This is the first mention of the word which later was to become so much more and more and more important in her life. Because then she can speak with knowledge in the name of her children and on behalf of her own rights. And men will have to listen to her. These words are commonplace enough to us. I think probably almost everyone gives some kind of assent to them. But they were like a ringing challenge to her time, to male vanity and arrogance when she spoke. The next appearance, I won't mention many, as I say, she became very involved in public speaking, was to a meeting of a national conference of Italian teachers. There were only 2 training colleges. Imagine, this is less than 100 years ago. There were only 2 training colleges for teachers in the whole of Italy, and she was the first woman to teach at one of them. And in that capacity, she was invited to speak at a national Italian teachers' conference. And there she began to speak about the all-importance of childhood education. She turned to a subject. When one thinks of history, it is very peculiar to think that this subject, the history of childhood, the history of psychology of childhood, had been almost totally ignored. It was a non-subject. What had one to learn from the child? 2 people, no one could speak of Madame Montessori for an hour without mentioning them, influenced her specially, as they must influence all of us. One, of course, was Rousseau. Rousseau was not only the precursor and to some extent the instigator of the French Revolution, he was also a revolutionary in many other ways, in the field of education and in his attitude to childhood. He was the first well-known person, perhaps the first of all, to assert the independence of childhood, that this was an independent human being, not a little adult, but an absolutely new, mysterious world which had to be entered carefully and humbly. Rousseau, you know, in 1762, wrote his ideas about education in a novel, Émile, one of the most sensational novels ever written. If by chance you haven't read Émile, 1762, at this point, please do so. I will quote just one paragraph to show what must have been some of the excitement of Madame Montessori's consciousness when she read these words, which so remarkably anticipated what she herself would try to do in her own schools. I just take one small passage. Rousseau wrote, "In the dawn of life, when memory and imagination have not yet begun to function, the child only attends to what affects its senses. He wants to touch and handle everything. Do not check these movements, which give him invaluable lessons," said Rousseau. "Thus he learns to perceive heat and cold, hardness, softness, weight, or lightness of bodies, to judge their size and shape, and above all their physical properties, by looking, feeling, listening, and above all by comparing sights and sounds, by judging with the eye what sensation they would cause to his hand." No one had written like this before. Unfortunately, when she read further into Rousseau, as you may know, she discovered even there unconquerable prejudices. Rousseau believed that this wonderful new freedom of education must be reserved to males and for wealthy people. Rousseau once said, "The poor need no education. Nature is their mistress. They will learn from her." And he was totally opposed to women having any independent education at all. "Let a girl," he said, "take the religion of her father. Let a wife take the religion of her husband." Mary Wollstonecraft in Ireland was also reading Rousseau and must have felt repelled in the same fashion. Still, Rousseau, with all his limitations, was a tremendous influence, as he must be on everyone today. And then she read a name not so well known to everyone, but I'm sure to those in the field of education very well known. Dare I say it, without the hyperbole to which everyone who speaks on the spur of the moment is liable? She encountered One of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived, in my view, far more strange than Rousseau. Johann Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi was born in 1746, 50 years younger than Rousseau, and died in 1827 at the age of 81. I won't dare to speak of Rousseau's disordered character here. Like Dostoevsky, he harbored criminal impulses, which is not perhaps unusual. But Pestalozzi, when we are young, we hope. Pestalozzi was, I think, the great misfit of all misfits who ever lived. He was totally unfitted for life. Look at his picture. You see that haunted face today. What am I doing alive in this brutal, beastly world? He feared, perhaps loathed, the unimaginative cruelty of the ordinary male-dominated human being, society. Pestalozzi could only live, this was his weakness and his great limitation, only by living with children. To say that he loved children would be an absurd understatement. He only lived with them. Money, fame, reputation. And curiously enough, the children he loved best were those who were poorest and most afflicted. If he could find feeble-minded children, children already disposed of as part of the refuse of life, these are the ones he loved. And he set up infant schools in his native Switzerland. In his own house, first of all. He took the very people that Maria Montessori would take. Rousseau never taught a child. His own 5 illegitimate children he sent to an orphanage. Pestalozzi established infant schools, ran them himself. They loved him. What happened? He became famous in spite of himself. Schools were established on the Pestalozzian model, as later on the Montessorian model. Do you know who one of Pestalozzi's school children were? I don't mean directly with himself, but who went to a Pestalozzian school. This is one of the strangest things in history. One of his products was Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, the founder of modern Germany in blood and iron. It's evident Pestalozzi's principles didn't always take root. I cannot help but think that encountering Pestalozzi was emotionally a far more powerful experience to Maria Montessori than Rousseau. We have to remember one other thing, alas. Every school that Pestalozzi founded failed. Everyone. He was a very poor administrator. Abundance of love is no qualification for executive capacity. All went wrong. And worse, he had a child himself. The child, alas, was an epileptic. His own child, he lived to be 31, I think, was a failure in life. The sorrows of Pestalozzi. And his life is more and more overhung with grief. Yet he was famous. When Napoleon had been overthrown and the Tsar Alexander of Russia came to Paris for the peacemaking, he made a special journey, the Tsar Alexander, to Yverdon in Switzerland, where Pestalozzi had his school. The Tsar of Russia came to visit. I've mentioned this as an example of the fame which attached to him. Alexander had a Swiss tutor, La Harpe, that's the connection. At any rate, Rousseau and Pestalozzi. Looking back now, we may ask, were there any things in Rousseau and Pestalozzi which Madame Montessori added to, completely new things? And I think maybe there's several, but two strike me. One thing, these were original with her, to my knowledge. It may be others had discovered them too, that's very possible. One was the idea, I think one of the powerful of all her ideas, that the child himself was he or her, that the infant was self-directing. That the child, as it were by instinct. Madame Montessori had enormous reverence for the instinct of birds and fish and animals. That power so swift beyond reason and so limited. She found that in children, that they knew what they wanted already. And the function of the teacher was to help them to realize it, not to tell them what to do. What we call the word maieutic, the function of the midwife, to bring to birth, not to create, but to help the act of creation. I don't think this is in the two figures I mentioned. And the second one, no doubt there are others besides these, I'm sure, but this one strikes me. Neither Rousseau nor Pestalozzi envisaged the education of children as leading to the transformation of society. They always thought that the ideal education would produce, hopefully, the ideal child. But how would the ideal child overcome the stupidities, the prejudices of society? Madame Montessori concentrated on this. In fact, she says in one place, much later, the root of all evil, she said, is the abuse of childhood. And by that, I don't think she meant merely physical abuse, but neglect of the child's potentialities, the failure to make the child realize himself. In other words, that if peace, Rousseau and Pestalozzi, I think, both thought war was inevitable, as one might well think. She thought if it could be overcome, and this idea grew more and more as she grew older, that the regeneration of humanity, if that were ever possible, could only rest upon a new concept of childhood and a new way of helping children to realize themselves. Well, I've spoken of these things thinking of the 10 years of preparation. Of course, she encountered many other ideas. Is it not strange that if we admire a person very much for his or her ideas, when we hear of some totally new field in which he expresses himself, we think he must be right. So it was here. Nearly every idea that I've encountered in Madame Montessori seems to me a good idea. For example, may I mention two profoundly important social ideas, nothing to do specifically with education. One was the idea which he expresses very early, that punishment, harsh punishment, was not only useless for education, stultifying, but of no use against crime. self-defeating. Of course, she wasn't the only one who felt this. Beatrice Webb in England, Bernard Shaw, and others at the same time, expressing the same ideas. She hadn't read them. She was revolted by the idea of punishment, still more of punishing children. What would she have thought of William Bennett of our time, who has suggested beheading criminals who engage in the drug trade? And she was constantly connected with poor children in Rome. The problem of poverty thrust itself upon her very early. What to do about poverty? As far as I know, she never called herself a socialist. But what she did say was that charity is no cure for poverty. She arrived at that insight very, very early. This apart from her interest in education. When she was 27 years of age, I beg your pardon, when she was 37 years of age, in 1907, she launched the experiment which was to make her as famous in the Europe of her day as Pestalozzi schools had made him famous in his day. The famous Casa dei Bambini in Italy. She went to a slum district in Rome, San Lorenzo, later bombed by Allied bombers during the Second World War. Her friends were putting your knowledge, your professional expertise in a slum district inhabited by little monsters. They'd been abandoned by their own parents in many cases. They'd been given up. They were refuse, child refuse. That was after 3 years or so. She taught these children to become civilized. Pestalozzi would have done the same thing. She loved them. That reminds me. Perhaps this is the moment where I should mention it, if you don't know already. She herself had had one child. Among her colleagues in psychiatry at the University of Rome was a young doctor, Giuseppe Montessano. They fell in love. They had a child. He left her. In the Italy of her day, she would have been ruined, of course, had it been known that she had an illegitimate child. The child was found out to... This was a common practice, of course, among males at that time and other times. She visited the child, Mario, he was called, brought him presents. He said, Mario, a beautiful lady used to visit me from time to time. When he was 13, he came to live with her, and from then on they were inseparable. She called him, first of all, her nephew, a practice which the popes had followed for centuries in speaking of their illegitimate children. And later she called him her son, her adopted son. And finally, at the very end of her life, by the time they went to India, when she was a lady in, I think, her 60s, it was said then, yes, he was my son. And he proved to be, they were inseparable, her translator, her guide. He spoke later perfect English. She read English, but wouldn't trust herself to speak in America or in any other place. And so Mario, who died in 1982, he left 4 grandchildren, grandchildren for her. Anyway, I mention him suddenly at this point because one asks, you must have wondered, as I do too, how much did the loss of her only son, she lost him in effect, others raised him, she saw him from time to time, How much were the little slum children in the hospital of the Bambini substitutes for the care and devotion which she was unable to lavish daily on her own child? She taught them, these little monsters, filthy, ragged, to read and write. She taught them clean habits. She taught them to respect one another. She made human beings out of them, civilized human beings. She became famous. The Queen of Italy, Queen Margherita, visited her settlement. The church became interested. She was famous almost overnight when the fame spread. And there she learned in practice what principles were involved fundamentally. May I go on quickly? As a result of this, undoubtedly, she came to the United States in 1913 for the first time. She was 43. She came 3 times to America, where she found a very warm reception in 1913, 15, 17. She had her son came with her, not yet openly acknowledged as such. He translated for her. She never learned to speak openly. His son said she spoke English quite well, but she didn't trust herself. In these American journeys, she was introduced on one occasion by John Dewey of Columbia. Dewey's chief propagandist, Dr. Kilpatrick, later criticized her very severely as not being sufficiently motivated for social cooperation. But Dewey praised her very highly. 2 of the greatest Americans of that time, Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell of the telephone, they both lavished praise upon her. And several hundred Montessori schools, I believe, were founded in the years that followed. In 1919, after her, she never returned to America. In 1919, she was invited to Buckingham Palace to meet the King and Queen of England. Her ideas and her schools had found reception there. And the Pope visited her, or she visited him, Benedict XV, so-called liberal Pope. She was, of course, a Catholic. She was invited to the Sorbonne in Paris, met Bergson, who found her ideas, Henri Bergson, very compatible. I think, for me personally, the most interesting tribute paid to her by a stranger in these years came from Freud. She wrote to Freud in 1917, speaking of her work. He must have heard about her already, and he wrote a letter which still survives, saying that his own daughter, Anna, who, as you know, was to spend her whole life in the field of child psychology, he said, my daughter Anna is a devoted pupil of yours. And as for me, he said, the brilliance of your reputation helps people to overcome the resistance which they encounter when they hear of my name. Madame Montessori never went very far in Freudian psychology. Ideas like infantile sexuality would, I think, have been repulsive to her. And never. But many of her followers did. Many of those who worked with her later became psychoanalysts. There's no essential. After all, who had done more than Freud himself to emphasize the extreme importance of early childhood? Perhaps this was why Freud was so enthusiastic, whatever else might divide them. These years, we've reached the 20s, were years of growing political tension. In 1922, when she was 52, Mussolini came to power in Italy. naked brutality. Mussolini endorsed Madame Montessori. He saw it as a means of advancing Italian national prestige. He became honorary president of a Montessori society, and she accepted this. I have to make one or two criticisms. I think she was so unworldly, so innocent of the brutality of politics and their cynicism, I think she could not have conceived of the horrors of fascism. She did later, and they broke. But Mussolini had already murdered Matteotti, that most lovable of Italian socialists, in 1924. Did Madame Montessori even know about that? Whoever heard of Matteotti's murder, his name is on every street in Italy today, in one street in every town, must have been revolted. When she discovered, he began to interfere. He demanded that Italian children sing the fascist hymn, La Giovinezza, before schools, which were fascist. She broke, of course. And in one day, Montessori schools were closed throughout Italy. It must have been, I think, the biographies I read, like Rita Kramer's and others, they don't speak much about this. It must have been a tremendous shock to her to discover the degree to which she had failed immediately to realize Mussolini's nature. But worse things were happening. Hitler appeared in 1933 as Chancellor of Germany. Madame Montessori was asked for the first time to speak to peace meetings, one at Geneva in 1932, one in Brussels, an International Peace Congress, in 1936. The catastrophe, which everyone knew was coming and no one could believe would happen, was approaching. A shift occurs from her interest in education as such to a quest for peace. Not that there was anything disparate between the two processes. The war came. Very little is said about the effect of the coming of war. When she was thrown out of Italy, her schools and her methods, she went to Barcelona, the home of anarchism in Spain, the home of Francisco Ferrer, that martyr to humane values. But the Civil War broke out, the most horrible war. George Orwell reminds us of it in Catalonia. She had to flee. She went to Holland. And in Holland, apparently, where she was to die and is buried, her ideas seem to have taken root more than anywhere in Europe. But on the eve of the war, within a few months of the outbreak, she went on invitation. An extraordinary episode in her life was about to begin, to India, the country of Gandhi. There was a remarkable Englishwoman, Annie Besant, lifelong agitator, orator, socialist, friend of Bernard Shaw and the Fabians, who had gone to India, a theosophist in Madras at the world-famous Theosophical Center, Ajar, and she was invited there. She had already met Gandhi in London when he came there, but she came to be connected with him naturally. She introduced her schools and her methods into India. A new experience. I can't possibly realize it. I doubt if anyone can. She was to teach the untouchable, the little child whose shadow fell upon another person's food and it was contaminated. The absolute outcast. There was nothing in Europe, or even in South Africa today, to compare with untouchability, this was a profound experience for her. She found, it's no surprise to us, she found that the same methods of love, respect, understanding, patience, which worked with the slum children of Europe, worked in India. There was no difference between the children of the untouchables and Brahmin children. Gandhi, of course, and one of her untouchable schools was in his own ashram near Ahmedabad in India. She spent 7 years, I think, in India, all the time of the war. And no doubt, I think, probably was much, not only by the horror in Europe. In the lives of Madame Montessori I've seen no mention of the Holocaust. This cannot mean she was unaware of it. Who could be? But so that it became the obsessive driving force of her life to stop such a thing happening again. She must also have been influenced by Gandhi's ideas. And when she came back, after the war was over, she began to write in a new way. Her writings are now largely concerned about peace. Could I quote her directly? There's no substitute, I regret. Her own living voice isn't here. We shall never hear it. I don't think it was ever recorded, as Caruso's voice was recorded. But the person who comes to my mind as I read these later statements of hers from 1946 onwards, it is Albert Einstein. I think you will feel too, when you hear some of these sayings, different from what she said before, it's almost identical with what Einstein was saying at the same moment. If I may quote one or two sentences. She writes in one place, "The time has come. Either mankind as a whole will organize and master what the translator calls it, I don't know what it was, the mechanical world, or the mechanical world will destroy humanity." In another place, she writes, the preeminent characteristic of our time is an incipient madness. An idea, after 40 years of the Cold War and several trillions of dollars spent, useless upon weapons, we might think is rather obvious. An incipient madness. And our most immediate need is a return to reason. If I were given that sentence and asked who wrote it, I would have said Einstein. She says, there is no term but moral chaos to describe our spiritual condition today. This was 50 years ago, nearly. Humanity is living on the edge of a precipice, threatened with total catastrophe. These are Einstein's, almost his very words. And finally, this one I'll quote. She says, an immense chapter of history, taking millennia to unfold, is now over. This also Einstein has said in his own epigrammatic way. So she threw herself into, she is now in her 70s, her middle and late 70s. By the way, when they went to India, her son was interned as an enemy alien. She was not interned. She was still Italian, but England was at war with Italy. The absurdity, she came to think that nationalism, it became an obsession, as with Arnold Toynbee, that was one of the worst. Her own son was interned because nominally he was an English subject of the king, as she was too, but they let her remain free. So I need hardly tell you that the kind of education for the child which she desired, a non-competitive, non-materialistic state of mind, an education based upon freedom, courage, self-discipline, self-training, was the psychological foundation, the inevitable foundation for the peace that she desired. She died at the height of the Cold War. I've not read any of her last thoughts. Living in around 1950, at the time of the Korean War, I must confess, feeling that destruction, total destruction, was inevitable. She was, of course, an unquenchable optimist. She probably would never have succumbed to pessimism. I think not. An unquenchable optimist. The object of our education, she once said, is the perfection of humanity. She is buried in a little Catholic cemetery just outside The Hague on the shore of the North Sea, Noordwijk. Her name and her influence survives, and little as I know about it, and I must regret I know so little, I hope it will continue to be, in this country, what she would have desired it to be. Not only a means of liberation, fulfillment for the child, but for humanity by making it less likely that war will occur. That became, these are twin impulses. Her later years were more and more devoted to, she had retired, of course, from active teaching. Little as I know, it seems to me, she was a truly extraordinary person. And I'm glad to see that here on the far Pacific, far away from the centers in which she dwelled, her name and her work are remembered. I thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giovanni Costigan. I think our procedure this evening will be to accept any questions those of you might have in the audience, and perhaps those first that you would like to address to Dr. Costigan. And then following that, we'll be glad to welcome any questions that you have about Montessori in the public schools, and we'll try to throw those questions around until we can find somebody who can give you a really accurate answer. So do we have a question for Dr. Montessori, or for Dr. Costigan on Dr. Montessori?
Did you, Dr. Costigan, did you ever find any reference to Buber's work and Montessori?
Whose work?
Martin Buber.
Buber.
The Hasidic.
The question was, did you find any reference to Martin Buber?
Oh, Buber, I beg your pardon. No, I didn't. No doubt they would have had much in common.
Yes.
I haven't found any. I don't say that she didn't. I've only read certain lives, several lives. But in her own writings, I've not found his name mentioned, nor perhaps someone here has. I found none.
Thank you for your question. Question over here.
But I was wanting to know how you saw her view of spirituality changing from her Catholicism background,
Oh,
having experienced
yes.
the Eastern.
Yes, I think I get the question for Catholicism, if I dare approach it. Of course, as a child, she had an intensely religious education due to her mother. When she went to the university and began to read widely, she came to doubt dogma completely. She became a positivist. She never called herself one, but in effect, she was a positivist, believing that science was the only salvation of mankind. And you understand, a humanist. She never abandoned that either, but the older she became, the more her childhood memories seem to have arisen, which is a very common thing, of course. And if I may make this remark, I don't wish to say foolish things. One says enough without knowing it, without deliberately making them. There are two different aspects to Catholicism. There's the Catholicism of Torquemada and the Inquisition. There's the Catholicism of St. Francis. And of course it's that Catholicism. The Catholicism of liberation theology in Nicaragua and Central America today, that I'm sure she would have embraced. That was what Catholicism meant to her. After all, Mussolini called himself a Catholic. He dared to. So I understand what, and the more in old age she never talked about it as far as I know, but she desired to be buried in a Catholic cemetery, and I think this is very understandable.
I have a question back here.
I think what I do want to know, and I'm interested in knowing
I'll repeat it.
how the Eastern philosophy influenced Maria Montessori.
Do you want to repeat that a little bit louder, please?
Eastern philosophy she learned in India and with the Brahmins, how it affected her belief system.
In what way did Montessori's experience in India with the Brahmins affect her?
I think all I can say is that it gave her a deeper philosophical insight into the need for peace. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence. I shouldn't use the word Brahmin, of course. She totally repudiate their pretensions. But ahimsa, non-violence, accepted as a way of life, as it had not been in Western Europe. I mean, people had advocated it, but never had a whole nation been led by one, Gandhi, who devoted himself to it. I think that was, as far as I know. She was never very theoretical. She was a very practical person. I can't answer your question any better, I'm sorry, than to say that. May I add just one? I certainly think you know, some of you know the name of Krishnamurti? Krishnamurti died a few months ago. I heard him speak once. My wife and I visited Adyar. I didn't know of Madame Montessori's connection at that time, and we heard Krishnamurti speak. Now, he was the protege of Annie Besant, whom I mentioned as Montessori's close friend. And Krishnamurti, I think, was one of the most impressive human beings I've ever met with. He radiated a certain tranquility and authority without ever in the least suggesting aggressiveness. This was the ideal of character. Annie Besant brought him up in a theosophical atmosphere, probably somewhat like Montessori. She never mentions Krishnamurti. Whether she met him or not, I don't know. But a nation or a society composed of people like Krishnamurti, I think, would have been what she desired.
We have a question here.
You said that she was not very theoretical, she was quite practical. What would you say would be some of the important things to note about what was the practical things she said her schools should try to do?
Do you need that repeated? What were some of the practical kinds of, or practical aspects that Dr. Maria Montessori would have stressed with regard to the schools?
I could try to speak about this. I would only reveal my ignorance, which is vast. This was one of those things, I hope Dr. McCartan, who has experience with this, I mean, I'm very, alas, ignorant. My own contact with Montessori teaching was simply this in the past. During my years at the university, I happened to come in contact, I knew some students who were Montessori teachers, and I only knew they were among the best, the most intelligent, the most thoughtful. I admired them tremendously. What they were doing must be good, but what that was exactly, I never knew. Perhaps Dr. McCartan could tell you more. It's a good question. I was afraid of exposing what must be exposed sooner or later.
I'll give it an attempt, and then maybe we can ask Marge Asano and some of the rest of you who are engaged in Montessori teaching right now. One of the things that I remember very well from my experience in Montessori in California was the fact that Montessori didn't talk about respect to children. She actually had them demonstrate it, the way they touched things, the way they cared for things, the putting away of materials rather than leaving them around, respect for themselves and respect for the other. But the word was not that important. It was the action. Marge, do you want to give us an idea?
We're talking about her practical contributions.
A little louder.
All right, and it's extraordinarily practical that she reduced the size of furniture. Until Montessori, children were climbing up into adult-sized tables and chairs, and their legs would fatigue. And as a physician, she realized this and remedied it by having all of the furniture made child-size. She invented the climbing gym. She was very practical in that hygiene was the initial part of her program. The children must be clean, cared for. They were measured, weighed, more or less studied. So she had a very practical aspect there, and they must be given skills that would help them in their daily life at home, so that they could take home some of the learning and culture that they were gaining in school to their very parents who lacked it. So all of that was very demonstrable. I'd like to say one thing about what she got in India, because it was so interesting to me, because now it's very common for us to talk about relaxation, meditation, dwell on the inner person, but she brought back the silence game, as all you Montessorians know, which is an exercise in which the child excludes the outer world and tries to find silence within himself, which is a very healing, refining, comfortable process. And I believe that's something that she brought back from India, has always been used in Montessori schools, and it's probably the most spiritual thing that we do, without saying so, is just letting the child go within and find his own presence. And
From what age on?
2.5, 3, whatever, they can sit for a couple of minutes.
Gail?
I have a question as to what do you think, Dr. Costigan, caused the empty space after Maria Montessori left India? It seemed from the little reading that I did very quickly that the impact that she made was only in the preschools, and I wonder why it didn't continue. What is happening that this idea has not continued all the way through? Even here in the United States, it's beginning now to change, but I wonder what it was that kept it so long from seeing that it is a way of life that we can learn. It's not just something that you teach in preschool.
Are you speaking primarily of her attitude towards teaching of children?
Well, I guess my question is, when I have spoken to Italians, they have said, well, we don't know very much about this at all. I mean, the majority of the people have said, well, we don't know very much about Montessori, even in Italy, or about her schools. We didn't go to those schools. Or in India, instead of going through a Montessori program, they just go so far and then they're back into the old traditional veins. And I wonder what happened.
Well, I don't really know, I can't say, but I would guess, immediately hearing what you say, that any new and potentially revolutionary thing is going to encounter opposition and without lack of understanding. Any kind, whether hers or someone else's. Not only hostility, but indifference. My guess would be that that was inevitable. She's probably aware of it. There may be other things, I don't know. That would be sufficient to. Any new thing, not all new things are good, of course, but anything which challenges people is going to arouse opposition, hostility, or, in time, neglect. I can't suggest more.
My other question is, people often talk now in early childhood circles about Piaget, and I wonder if in your readings, if you could connect the two of them.
I don't know now. No, Piaget was interested in her very much. He praises her. Piaget is, I think, the supreme theoretician of childhood. I haven't read him myself. I can't tell what she got. I doubt if she got anything from Piaget, he appreciated what she'd done independently and approved of it. But I remember once Robert Oppenheimer expressing his total devotion to Piaget. I regret to say I still haven't read Piaget. I'm doomed to read about the Kaiser and Bismarck instead.
Gail, there's a very fine article comparing Montessori and Piaget in the Harvard Educational Review of about 10 years ago, but does a nice job in terms of comparing the two. And I think the fact that they were both interested in the learning process in young children, and that's the tie. They both, Piaget's method was looking at what the child knew from seeing how he responded to questions. Montessori, on the other side, came about forming the child so that the child would have those concepts and understandings in order to do. So they came at it from two different ways, but they were both interested primarily in the processes and not in the product of the child. Anybody else want to contribute there? Certainly much more we could say. Are there other questions? Dick Carberry.
I don't know that Giovanni has seen his friend.
Little louder, Dick.
The person you mentioned, Krishnamurti. Seems to me he's on Seattle television, Giovanni, once a week.
Yes.
On Channel 29.
I-
Although he died relatively recently,
Yes,
he continues to be heard and seen on Channel 29. Have you seen him on?
yes, once I did.
Mhm.
Would you tell the rest if they haven't heard?
Yes, Dick Carberry was saying that the person that Dr. Giovanni had mentioned, say his name again, Dick,
Krishnamurti.
Krishnamurti, could be seen, although he is no longer living. Some of his works are shown on Channel 29. Do you remember any particular time, Dick?
I don't, but I could, if anybody would like to call, I know it continues to be seen every week. It may well be on Thursday. I'm not sure.
We can pursue that. Thanks,
I
Dick.
was going to say that Gandhi's youngest son taught at the University of Washington, I think it was in '79, and I had Giovanni and Ramchandra Gandhi come over for coffee one morning at the hub. But I think that when Giovanni said that Einstein and Montessori and other well-known contemporaries of hers could well have been saying essentially the same thing. Well, this youngest Gandhi, if you listen to him, he did a great program with Dr. Hubert Locke, and the two of them, that's a tape you could get at the University of Washington. It's really worthwhile hearing. But I think that India had the good luck to have people like Nehru and this youngest son of Gandhi carry on a nonviolent tradition and a peace-loving tradition. And even though India has had its troubles over the years, I think as long as they can turn out people who reflect in some ways the 7 years that Montessori spent in India, that India can count itself blessed. If they turn out more people like Gandhi and this one son of Gandhi that was here in the Northwest. So her melody lingers on. A lot of people.
Yes, thank you. I would add, I certainly think of the fact that Indian education today, I shouldn't even mention since I know so little, but apparently she's made she failed completely. But India today is nationalistic, militaristic, going in for nuclear weapons. Alas, not her fault. It's made almost no impression. I speak under correction. I think this is true.
Another question back here. Excuse me.
I'm quite interested in the nuts and bolts of how she continued all her schools. Were her schools self-supporting, or did she go to foundations and individuals for money?
Well, the question was, did Montessori seek funding from individuals, corporations to continue her schools, or were they self-supporting? We'll ask for some help on that. Does anybody remember? I never remember any reference to looking for foundations. I do remember in the early days when she started the Casa de Bambina, and you mentioned that too, that she did get help at that time, but I don't remember her soliciting any. Yes?
Well, what I remember Angela Martin mentioning that there was a lot of wealthy families were into giving charity, and so they donated
Thank you. Any other? Yes.
Funding was extremely difficult for Dr. Montessori, and as she traveled, as she attempted to establish schools, it was always, as a matter of fact, we followed her, tried to keep this aspect of need for funds away from her so that she would not become depressed. And so we know that Alexander Graham Bell and his daughter, many prominent Americans, attempted to establish schools. The editor of the Flourish magazine offered that she would to help support her, but that adventure fell through, and she was very disenchanted with Americans. It was always a problem.
She had that in common with Piaget, too. It seems that we're being told then that those who were helping Maria Montessori kept the pressure of funding and money away from her to an extent as much as possible, and that therefore perhaps that's why she doesn't mention it to any great extent. Funding.
Oh, I don't know.
No.
About her school, you mean?
Yes,
Actually,
funding.
wealthy patrons.
Wealthy patrons, right. And that's been the history of Montessori in this country. I think for many years, at least 20 or 30 years ago, maybe even 40, it was only the wealthy youngsters who could afford it, and I don't think we're too far away from that now because the expenses were so high. And it was, certainly that was true in California for a long period of time. We didn't have any of the youngsters, the handicapped youngsters, the very poor youngsters who were getting a Montessori education.
Could you tell a little bit, do you know whether the Montessori movement to get Montessori in the public schools is happening in other cities in this country, and why this is happening here in Seattle?
Frederica, are you here?
Go ahead.
Come on up, please. I think this is the lady who's the president of the group and who has spearheaded it, so we'll ask her to help. Thank you.
Thank you. Who asked that? Oh. I had the opportunity a couple years ago to attend a public school conference in Kansas City, and that's where I started to get interested in this. And what I found out there was that there have been cities in this country which have had public school programs for many years. And I think sometimes in the Northwest we're a little isolated from the national picture, and it wasn't apparently very well known by very many people. But at this point there are something like 60 public school districts across the country which have Montessori programs, and I recently read that actually one small district has gone Montessori through all its buildings, which is amazing to me. I think it was in Iowa. It was in the Public School Montessorian, which is a publication put out now.
So there are some other models to draw from.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And that's what makes it feasible, it seems to me, to bring something to Seattle, because I'm no expert on this, and I don't think there are really very many people in this community who are real familiar with this kind of a program. But luckily, there's been some research done, there's been some documentation. The people in Denver have done a really good job of documenting their process from the very beginning. And there have been a lot of successes documented in raising minority test scores and in drawing people to schools that otherwise weren't getting a lot of enrollment. I'm particularly interested in these urban programs where the program's being used as a magnet, because that's the need for Seattle. And so the programs I'm looking at are the ones in Milwaukee, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Denver, Buffalo.
We have a Montessori magnet class in Bremerton, Washington, in existence now.
Want to repeat that for people so the others can hear it?
Marge was saying that there's a Montessori magnet in Bremerton. That's great. I didn't know that. No, there is a Montessori program in Spokane, too, Spokane, Washington. There are Montessori classes in Portland, and there's a large program in Vancouver, BC. So we've kind of got it all around us.
Are these elementary school?
Frequently elementary, mostly elementary. The preschool level programs are harder to obtain, of course, because state funding isn't available usually for that kind of thing. The Seattle program does have a preschool component. We're trying to raise money for the preschool component, primarily because that is what is so unavailable to families which cannot afford to go to the private sector. And it is very important to begin at the preschool level, so the preschool component has to be available.
I have a dream
Mario still alive? Maria?
No. Mm-mm.
When did he die?
1982.
I must have missed that. But did he make himself available to Montessori gathering, either in Europe or?
Oh, yeah. He spoke and lectured a great deal. Hmm. I think he was very closely associated with the group in Holland, working on materials, training teachers.
Are there tapes of him?
There's one called Follow the Child that I think has a lot of the pretty famous Montessorians on it. Do you see on that one? Yeah.
And that will now be in the Seattle Public Library. That will be available to the public. They purchased it, and they said in about 5 months or so, you should be able to go to the public library and see the tape with, I even think Dr. Montessori's voice is on that tape. And there are photographs of her, and the people that she worked with in India, there are some people there. I only saw it once, because Freddie had shown it at one of our meetings, and I thought it was excellent to introduce people to Montessori.
I just have a comment to make, having put 3 children in preschool in Montessori 25 and 27 years ago. And in reading some of this with Montessori, I'm surprised at how it jars with the child he, as opposed to Dr. Costigan, who was saying he or she, or some of the references I hear here to Montessorians saying the student he, and if in the Milwaukee paper that says he. And I think if it's one thing that the Northwest could give to Montessori, it would be to rewrite all the material to include females in every sentence. It's just a comment how it's very glaring all of a sudden.
May I make a comment on that? The one thing, if I could do anything about it, is to invent a word, as some languages have, which implies he and she. We have to say he does or she does, which is a little awkward. So we say she, of course, he did most of the doing. And but if you wanted, don't want that to happen, then we must come up with the compound.
Well, I agree with you, except I think it's a small price to pay right now since we have no other word.
Were there any other questions? Oh, sorry.
This is in translation. She's always translated mankind to speak, not humanity.
Yes, I can.
Yes.
So
You wanted to
whether
get
it's
it on
different in
tape.
heaven, I don't know.
I don't know if it's on.
Did you want to repeat that last?
No, no, it's not.
We need
Were there any other questions? Yeah.
What will be the criteria for choosing the children that will be able to go to the preschool, the one preschool Montessori class at this point? I'm just curious, will it be a financial criteria, or will it be a neighborhood criteria?
The student selection process for the Seattle School District is a very detailed process, more detailed than comprehension can possibly meet. And the final, well, the preschool will be somewhat separate in a sense. Registration at the preschool level will be on-site, which is different from registration at the elementary level, which is centralized. But at the same time, that final process for selection will have to be consistent to some degree with the Seattle Public Schools guidelines, and that will probably be decided in a final planning process, which the district will have a lot to say about. Our idea is that it's basically open to any child of age 3 or 4. We're starting with 3 and 4-year-olds. But it will have to fall into minority desegregation ratios. There is probably no doubt about that. I imagine there will be a neighborhood draw, essentially. There would be no busing involved for the preschool component. But primarily open, first come, first serve, based on ability to pay within the sex and minority ratios that they try to keep. No, based on ability to pay. So, no, it will be free, but as has been done in other programs, and as is also used in Seattle School District currently for some preschool programs, ability to pay allows you to support the program to the extent that the families can. Sliding scale.
What's your timeline, and what do you most need now?
All right, the goals for this year are twofold, primarily. And these have come directly from a meeting with the superintendent and the central cabinet with the district. One is outreach to the community. There are whole areas of Seattle which don't have exposure to Montessori programs. I do have a map that shows the distribution of the private Montessori schools in Seattle, and the southeast section of Seattle has very little exposure to Montessori. So community outreach, getting out to families who may not be aware of what this option would be or whether they'd want to use it or not. And that includes, I think, for us as a group, multicultural sensitivity, because a major component of this is making it available to people who aren't using it, and I think it's pretty well known that if you look among our private schools that our cultural ratio is not reflective of the city as a whole. And the second would be fundraising, of course. And our fundraising program is looking for broad-based support, state support at the elementary level, perhaps city support at the preschool level, PIPE support, that's Partners in Public Education, and sponsorship by private businesses, foundations. I hope to go to the county. I don't think the county thinks of itself as a group that should sponsor education, but to the extent that they have something like a $500 million budget on crime, I think that they should sponsor programs which help individuals reach a level of potential where they're not at risk to the greatest extent of prison terms, where they are best prepared for college, where there's lower juvenile delinquency. And luckily there are research studies which show this. The high school preschool study does show correlation with high quality preschool and lowered rates of juvenile delinquency, et cetera. And there are counties in other parts of the country which are supporting urban school programs. We are, of course, also looking for individual donations. Our budget, the monies that we hope to raise towards this program, primarily towards the preschool program, are listed outside, and I'm figuring something like $115,000 for the first year, primarily for the preschool program, also for aides, because the district doesn't fund aides at the elementary level either. Our numbers are fluctuating to a certain extent, but I have someone in the district helping us with that to nail down the exact numbers. It also depends upon the final picture of the program, whether it's 3 preschool classrooms and 3 elementary classrooms, which we're trying to, that's our proposal essentially, is 6 classrooms by 1991, beginning with first graders with 2 previous years of Montessori experience and 3 and 4-year-olds. Or whether we end up with 3 preschool classrooms perhaps and a citywide draw elementary classroom. That's a possibility too. So budget figures vary. We do need your donations.
Thank you very much. We're going to come to a close now, and I want to thank you very much for coming to this first lecture, and thank again Rosemarie McCartan and Dr. Costigan. Our next lecture, it will be Bob Bradbury, and he will be speaking on the new democracy in education and the new language of democracy, because truly we need to learn this new language in order to make peace come about. Thanks again and good night.